think Russia's in a very strong position now and getting stronger by the hour, not even by the day, by the hour. Rapidly increasing global prices on the oil and gas markets are a huge benefit for Russia. It's revitalizing the Russian economy. Now, of course, Russia needs that to remain the case for a longer period. They need that to be not for a matter of days, they need it to be for months, ideally, to really replenish their budgets. But at the moment, it's looking very advantageous for the Russians because, of course, they're not hostage to this war. Their energy supplies do not have to go through the Gulf region, and so they are in an extremely strong position. There's only a few countries, I think, like them: the Americans, of course, the Norwegians, some of the North African countries, and some of the South American countries, Nigeria as well. But the hub of global gas and oil exports now is under siege, essentially, and so those who are not under that are in a very strong position, the Russians especially. So this is a massive boost for the Russian economy and for Putin's war economy at a time when he really needed it, because they were starting to feel a lot of pressure. Things were starting to look very dark for Russia economically, but all of a sudden now it's a new dawn, it's a new day. The sun is shining on Russia again economically, and Putin now, his war chest is expanding.
Hi everyone, welcome to 24 War and Politics YouTube channel. My name is Maxym Krapivnyy. Today my guest is Peter Dickinson, British journalist and Atlantic Council Fellow. Thank you for being in our program, Peter.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you.
Peter, how do you understand current Hungary-Ukraine confrontation? I mean, is it story only about Orban's pre-election campaign or anything more and deeper, in your opinion?
Well, I think Orban is first and foremost, in geopolitical context, he is the Kremlin's representative in the EU. So his role has been for the past 12 years has been as the spoiler to prevent Ukraine from integrating into the EU, to minimize Western support for Ukraine, and to do everything possible to facilitate the Russian conquest of Ukraine. So he's built this legend up of a confrontation between Hungary and Ukraine, which is completely artificial. There's no real conflict of interests or competition between Hungary and Ukraine. There never has been, and there never could be, realistically, unless we talk about sort of revanchist territorial claims, which Hungary has against all of its neighbors, not only Ukraine. But we see very specifically that Orban is focused on Ukraine. So really, he's a proxy here against Ukraine for the Kremlin, for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, but actually, when it comes to current situation, okay, for those who are not familiar with latest news, Hungarian special services detained Ukrainian debt collectors. At the same time, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine advises Ukrainians not to travel to Hungary. At the same time, Orban demands the restoration of the Druzhba pipeline, etc., etc., and etc. I mean that now Orban is escalating situation.
Yeah, well, no, he'd like to escalate it, yes, because he thinks it's the only way he can get re-elected, by sparking a crisis. He thinks that the Hungarian population could be persuaded to rally around the flag and around the Orban flag, as it were, in the sense that they're in some sort of confrontation with Ukraine. You know, some people even speculate that he may use some sort of artificially engineered crisis to postpone or cancel the elections. I mean, I think that's far-fetched, to be honest, but I think it's a very good sign. It's a very clear indication of how poorly he's done as a prime minister in recent years, that his only real appeal for a re-election now is to try and demonize Ukraine and create an enemy out of Ukraine. But as far as I can see, the vast majority of Hungarians don't buy into this nonsense at all. It's a very weak argument, the idea that Ukraine is somehow looking for an argument or looking for a fight with Hungary. You know, I think most Hungarians, from what I can see from the polling data, recognize that as a completely absurd argument. But it seems that Orban has nothing else. He doesn't really seem to have any other strong arguments. In the past, he's rallied against the European Union, against Soros, these sort of demonized figures, but that doesn't resonate with the Hungarians either now. And Orban's own support for Putin is, I think, also very unpopular with a lot of Hungarians. They're very uncomfortable with the fact that Orban has become essentially a puppet of the Putin regime in the EU. So all he's got left now is some sort of a war with Ukraine, which is very, very far-fetched, to put it mildly.
Mm. To summarize this topic, I would like to ask you: do you believe that after elections, after election campaign, level of escalation will be decreased?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Well, if Orban loses the election, as we expect, there will be no tension. Hungarian-Ukrainian relations will go on to a completely new level and will be as productive as Ukrainian relations with all of their neighbours, well, most of their neighbours on the EU side. Of course, there are issues with all of Ukraine's neighbours. Ukraine has strong links with Poland, but there are problems with the farmers, for example, on the border, and there are historical confrontations there. There are historical demons there to slay, as it were. Ukraine has issues with the Romanians, with the Moldovans, certainly with the Slovakians, but with all of those countries, they have broadly supportive relations. And if Orban loses his election next month, then I think that relations with Hungary will go on to a completely different level, and we will see an end to this past 12 years of Hungary being the primary blocker of Ukraine's European and NATO integration.
Peter, let's talk about war in Iran in terms of Russian capabilities to continue a war of attrition against Ukraine. On the one hand, we see that oil prices are rising. It's obviously beneficial to Russia. On the other hand, Russian shadow fleet, which is supposed to transport this oil, is under attack. According to current geopolitical and military conditions, is Russia capable of receiving enough money for war of attrition against Ukraine due to oil export?
Yes, I think Russia's in a very strong position now and getting stronger by the hour, not even by the day, by the hour. Rapidly increasing global prices on the oil and gas markets are a huge benefit for Russia. It's revitalizing the Russian economy. Now, of course, Russia needs that to remain the case for a longer period. They need that to be not for a matter of days, they need it to be for months, ideally, to really replenish their budgets. But at the moment, it's looking very advantageous for the Russians because, of course, they're not hostage to this war. Their energy supplies do not have to go through the Gulf region, and so they are in an extremely strong position. There's only a few countries, I think, like them: the Americans, of course, the Norwegians, some of the North African countries, and some of the South American countries, Nigeria as well. But the hub of global gas and oil exports now is under siege, essentially, and so those who are not under that are in a very strong position, the Russians especially. So this is a massive boost for the Russian economy and for Putin's war economy at a time when he really needed it, because they were starting to feel a lot of pressure. Things were starting to look very dark for Russia economically, but all of a sudden now it's a new dawn, it's a new day. The sun is shining on Russia again economically, and Putin now, his war chest is expanding.
Yeah, but actually, on the other hand, Syria, Venezuela, Iran, we see that Russia has been losing its allies. And actually, how does this affect Putin's intentions and capabilities? Because on the one hand, we see that oil prices are rising. On the other hand, we see that Russia has been losing its allies, including Iran.
Well, these allies didn't bring Russia anything. Iran gave Russia the blueprints for the drones that it now makes itself. So Iran was perhaps providing Russia with some drones, was perhaps providing Russia with some missiles, but it was not providing them with very much at all. So the loss of Iran brings no major losses for Russia in terms of its war capabilities. Syria, similarly, I mean, Syria was an important platform for Russia to project strength and power southwards into the Middle East and especially into Africa. So that's impacted them there, but it has no impact on Russia's war in Ukraine. Venezuela also, likewise. So these are all very important blows for Russia in terms of prestige. I think it's clear today that Russia is no longer a global power. Russia now, in today's world, it's a regional power. It's able to project strength only very, very close to Russia's borders itself. And Russia is clearly overextended in Ukraine now and is unable to really expand its influence anywhere. On the contrary, we see them losing influence in its former backyard in Armenia, in Moldova, other countries in the former Soviet space, in Central Asia. But this is a matter of prestige, really, and Russia's long-term status. In terms of its ability to wage war, these losses, they're humiliations for Russia. Syria, Venezuela, Iran, they are very humiliating. They're very damaging for Russia's reputation, but they have no impact on Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. On the contrary, I think they convince Putin that he has to push on and achieve victory in Ukraine because it's all he's got. He's got nothing else, literally. He's committed himself to win the war in Ukraine, to conquer Ukraine, to erase Ukraine from the map, to extinguish Ukrainian statehood. And if he doesn't achieve that now, he's really come out of this with nothing because he's lost his influence everywhere else.
Don't you think that you underestimate Iranian military aid to Russia? I mean, Shaheeds, I mean, ballistic missiles.
Not according to the information I have, no. I think that in the first year of the war, Iran provided Russia with a lot of Shahed drones. The missile situation is not quite as clear. Maybe they're receiving more. But as far as I'm aware, they've received a limited amount of missiles throughout the war. It's not key. And in terms of the Shahed drones, Russia very specifically sought to get the plans, the technologies from Iran very early on because they understood that there was a vulnerability here. And Russia has, I think it's public knowledge that Russia has established very, very large, the world's largest, in fact, drone manufacturing production facilities in Russia itself, where they've also modified the drones, made them much more effective, faster, bigger, more explosive, deadlier, with various different bells and whistles and all sorts of different modifications and upgrades. But the main message is that they are producing them themselves in Russia. They don't need Iran for that. So they really aren't losing very much in that case. I think people would, of course, like to hope that they were losing somehow, but I think on the contrary, they now have the capabilities to produce these domestically. They don't need Iran for that. And in fact, what we're seeing now from the Middle East, the reports in the last few days, is that it's actually now Russia that is giving technologies and perhaps even also drones to the Iranians.
Yeah, I got you. Peter, given how rapidly world events are developing, I would like to ask you, where is expected to happen a new hotbed of conflict on the planet, in your opinion?
Where will be the next area of conflict?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think the Middle East at the moment looks like it could expand further. I think that's going to be there's potential now. The next few weeks are going to be absolutely crucial to see whether the Trump administration tones this down now, tries to close off this war essentially with the Iranians, or whether it escalates into a much bigger thing that could last, for years potentially. So I mean, I don't think I wouldn't look much beyond that at this stage. But of course, the main threat for a major escalation geographically, I think, would still be Europe, would still be the idea of Russia going further if Russia were not to be stopped in Ukraine. I think if Russia is able to achieve its goals in Ukraine, if they establish a puppet regime in Kiev or conquer the whole country, then Putin would have the two largest armies in Europe at his disposal, the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. I think it would be very, very unlikely in those circumstances that he would not go further. So then we would see the Russians taking over Moldova. We would see the Russians testing NATO, probably in the Baltic states or maybe Poland, and perhaps looking to go further into Europe there. That's probably the most likely scenario for the next, maybe the short term, maybe the next 2 or 3 years, if we're talking the geographical threats.
Yeah, but actually, what do you think about maybe Southern America, for instance, Cuba?
I think the Americans may well try to depose the regime in Cuba, yeah, but I mean, I wouldn't see that as a major conflict. I wouldn't categorize that as a major conflict. I would categorize that as like, although it's a cliche now, but as a military operation. As we saw in Venezuela, the Americans went in, took out the guy, decapitated the regime, and then said, okay, let's do business. I think the situation in Cuba would probably be along similar lines. Even if there were a prolonged conflict there, it would be a local affair between the Americans Americans and the Cubans, because nobody would be able to support the Cubans. The Russians would be the traditional ally, the traditional source of support for Cuba. That's not going to happen. So I don't see that as being a major global hotspot, although certainly the Americans are already saying that the Cuban regime is going to fall, and that could happen any moment.
Mhm. Let's get back to Russian oil. I would say the main source of money for Russians. Approximately 80% of Russian oil was imported by China and India in 2025. Every now and then, Donald Trump says that Narendra Modi convinces him that India will not buy Russian oil. In return, will increase import from US and Venezuela. I would like to ask you, how can events develop in oil triangle Russia, China, India further? And under what circumstances this triangle can fall apart?
Well, the Indians of today just received a reprieve from Trump to allow them to continue. I think for a 1 month period to continue importing more Russian oil and not to suffer sanctions penalties for that in relation to what we're seeing, what's taking place in Iran and the Gulf at the moment. So, Trump's efforts to get India off Russian oil, to get them to stop buying Russian oil, are being put on pause, in other words, while the war in Iran plays out, which I think is a sign of the times. And presumably, if the war in Iran continues, then the whole issue of suppressing Russian trade to India Russian oil trade to India will also become, not a priority for the Americans, and perhaps they'll be prepared to turn a blind eye for the long term. So I think there's a very strong interlinking there between India's purchase of Russian oil and the events taking place in and around Iran at the moment with the Americans. The Chinese, I think, will continue to buy Russian oil, for as long as they wish to do so and as much as possible. They are essentially now the colonial master of the Russians. I mean, they treat Russia as a colonial resource now. They buy resources from Russia at the price that they set in Beijing, not at the price that Russia asks for. And Russia really has little choice but to accept that and to continue trading with them. So the Chinese essentially have Russia where they want them, and I don't think that's going to change in the short to medium term. The Chinese will continue with that relationship because it's very, very profitable for them, and the Americans are not able to exert the kind of pressure on the Chinese that they are on the Indians. The Indians are probably the weakest point in the triangle there, but as I said, at the moment, we just saw in recent months Trump had been very effective at forcing the Indians to cut back. That was starting to have an impact on Russia. But now, because of events around Iran, we see Trump saying, okay, it's on pause, carry on as you were, because we understand the circumstances have become a little bit more difficult, a little bit different, and we're not able perhaps to compensate or to substitute. So a lot of factors at play there. China's going to remain the main partner for Russia, the main economic beneficiary of Russia's position now, the colonial master, as I say. Russia will remain the vassal. India, I think a lot will depend on other factors, especially what's happening in Iran.
Let's talk about Europe in detail. During his meeting with Donald Trump, Friedrich Merz said that Europe will not allow any decision on Ukraine to be made without European participation. And also, Friedrich Merz showed Ukrainian map to Trump to convince that front line must not be changed, otherwise road to Kyiv will be opened again for Russians. How do you assess Mertz's visit to United States, and how do you understand current frame of US-EU relations?
Well, I mean, I think that Mertz is trying hard. It's good to see him go there. It's better than nothing. But I think fundamentally, Trump does not really pay much attention to the Europeans. He does not take them very seriously. He does not regard them as major geopolitical players, because as far as Trump's concerned, they don't put their money where their mouth is. They're not strong enough. They're not decisive enough. We see now what's going on in around Iran. Whatever you may think about it, however much it may look like perhaps a chaotic or an inappropriate or an illegal operation, there's a lot of decisions being made there. There's a lot of decisiveness. That's the way Trump operates. So as he looks at Europe, they're wishy-washy. They don't really have any strong leadership. They can't do anything proper. And as far as Trump's concerned, they've not taken the lead over Ukraine until very recently, when he's forced them to do so. So I don't think he's inclined to give them a major say in any sort of peace process, I think it's quite clear that he wants to have a deal with Putin between America and Russia. Now, Ukraine will be involved to some degree because we're talking about Ukraine here. It's the matter in hand is Ukraine's borders, essentially, Ukraine's status, Ukraine's sovereignty, and so forth. So Ukraine has to be involved. But Trump would be quite happy to keep the Europeans completely out of it. And Merz can go there and say we must be involved. But I don't know how he's going to leverage that unless he gets tough. Because when Trump pushes the Europeans, they tend to cave on trade deals and whatnot. So I don't know what leverage Merz is bringing to the table here. I think the fact that he's an intelligent, a very very impressive man personally is not necessarily going to sway Trump. Trump looks at Europeans and says, "You're weak. You're not strong people. I don't have to listen to you because I listen to the strong men." The strong men in mind, it's the Chinese, it's Putin first and foremost.
Yeah, you have noticed Chinese factor, Chinese role. We see that axis of evil is falling apart, but China seems to remain the main character. I would like to hear from you your expectation from the upcoming meeting between Trump and Xi, and what outcome can be.
Well, I think if you're China now, you've got to be feeling quite comfortable, quite confident about what's taking place. You're seeing that everywhere you look, there's all sorts of chaotic situations and conflicts arising, and China's not being directly involved in any of it. On the contrary, China's able to consolidate and use its position to somehow gain ground, as it were, geopolitically. I think the Chinese will be very comfortable watching America become bogged down in another war in the Middle East, which doesn't have an obvious conclusion to it. It's not even clear, as I think has been made obvious in recent days. It's not clear exactly what the end goal is for the Americans here. So very difficult to see how they're going to be able to get out of this and extricate themselves quickly. That was the case, of course, with Iraq, 2 decades ago. It looks to be potentially the case now with Iran. The Chinese will certainly welcome that. They'll love to see the Americans bogged down. The Chinese also look at the way the Europeans are preoccupied now with the war in Ukraine. They look at the way that Russia is preoccupied by the war in Ukraine, how Russia now has become this vassal of the Chinese, has basically become completely dependent on China. So there's a lot to like if you're Chinese now and you're looking out at the geopolitical environment, the landscape, as it were, and seeing all these different conflicts and all of them somehow offering something beneficial to the Chinese. So I think that when they go into this summit, the Chinese will be they'll listen to what Trump has to say, but then they'll be in no rush to make any compromises or anything else. They'll be simply looking to see how they can gain more and what the position of the Americans is. But I think they feel probably they're in a strong position now, and there's a strong likelihood that position will become even more solid in the months ahead.
Yeah, but economy will be the main topic on this meeting, yeah?
Well, I mean, I think always that's what the Americans and the Chinese talk about, but there's always a subtext of influence and global roles, so there's always, of course, China's support for Russia, for example, will be something that will be discussed in terms of the economy, but also in terms of other areas in which they support Russia. Now, that's not something that probably either party will talk about very much publicly, but it's also part of the discussion. I mean, I think in terms of the trade relationship, they're looking to have a mutually beneficial relationship. Neither of them is looking to rock the boat. And Trump has been quite cautious in terms of using economic tools against the Chinese. Let's see which way they go. But I don't think Trump's in any position now to be throwing his weight around against Beijing.
I would like to ask you about potential participation of China in the peace talks, because during his meeting with Friedrich Merz, Xi stated that there has to be provided equal participation of all parties in peace talks. After this statement, some experts said that China can join to trilateral peace talks between US, Russia, and Ukraine. How do you assess possibility of Chinese participation, and under what circumstances it could happen?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. I mean, the idea of the Chinese involvement. I think the Chinese have made a couple of attempts to get involved. They've sort of floated a few peace plans or peace visions over the past few years, but none of it's been very well received. The Chinese don't have not much of a history or not a lot of experience in that aspect of geopolitics, of getting involved in conflict resolution on the global stage. It's not their strong suit, to put it mildly. So I'm not sure exactly whether we're going to see them become more deeply involved here, whether they have the competence or whether they feel comfortable in that sort of environment. And broadly speaking, the Chinese want the war to continue. I think that's clear. They're benefiting in every sense. They're benefiting from Europe being preoccupied, America to a degree being preoccupied, and certainly the Russians being completely preoccupied, and the Russians becoming dependent on China. So from the Chinese point of view, this ticks a lot of boxes for them. They want the war to continue. They don't want Russia to win, because that would undermine their control over Russia. They don't want the West to win, because that would consolidate the West, that would boost Western prestige globally, increase Western influence, and so on. What they really want is for the war to continue, if possible, indefinitely. So if they did enter into the peace process, I would, maybe it's cynical of me, but I would expect their role to be that not particularly constructive, let's say.
When it comes to peace process, as you know, we have new exchange of prisoners of war. What does it indicate in terms of peace talks?
Absolutely nothing. The exchange of prisoners is a kind of bare minimum level, so that people can say, it's like the heartbeat of a coma patient, so that you can still say the patient is still alive, although he's been in a coma for years. You still are able to register a heartbeat. Essentially, that's what these prisoner exchanges are. It's just a way for both parties, and especially the Russians, to say, look, something is happening. There is some progress. There is some development here, because the peace process itself is absolutely fake, is absolutely false. There's no progress whatsoever. And all we see from the Russian side is that they don't really want peace at all. They're just dragging this process out because they don't want to incur the wrath of Trump and perhaps, additional sanctions, or to give Trump an excuse to increase support for Ukraine or whatever it may be. So it's in their interest to drag this process out. But there's really no indication whatsoever that Russia has any interest in a genuine peace. So these prisoner exchanges are really just a way of keeping things ticking along and being able to say to the Americans, look, we've done something. We haven't gone in there and come out with nothing. And I think it was quite telling today that Witkoff, one of the key American envoys, did a big post about the peace, about these prisoner exchanges, talking about it, as I say, saying what a great sign of progress. Look how we've achieved this. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to the Russians. Thanks to the Ukrainians. Thanks to the Swiss. Everyone deserves a slap on the back, as it were, and a handshake, because he obviously is conscious that he needs to show that something is happening. There's some purpose to these endless, meaningless talks. And so that's essentially the role of the prisoner exchanges. But I would say that beyond that, it doesn't have any important symbolism.
And the last question, Peter, in your personal opinion, what is the biggest fear of Vladimir Putin right now?
Well, I think we'd have to look at Ukraine. It's about Ukraine. I think that if we look at this war, I think his biggest fear is that he's not going to win the war in the way he wants to win it. He's looking at it, he doesn't see how he's going to achieve his goals. His goal has been, I think, if you analyze his actions, his statements, and the context, that his goal has always been to destroy Ukraine as a state and as a nation, to eradicate Ukrainian statehood and to wipe Ukraine off the map. That's been his overall objective, and it doesn't look like he's going to be able to achieve that. He holds 20% of Ukraine now. His army's taken around 1% in the last few years, while suffering, pretty catastrophic casualties. They've not been able to make any breakthroughs on the battlefield. Their army is getting weaker rather than stronger, I would say. And on the contrary, Ukraine is getting stronger and getting more confident, particularly technologically, with drone warfare. So it's not clear how Putin's going to make this breakthrough and how he's going to get beyond that. So at some point, he must now realize he's going to have to come to the Russian people and say, you know what, it didn't happen. And when we look at a peace deal where Ukraine emerges as an independent country and is able to join the European Union, for example, to integrate further into the West, and to continue developing a very strong military and to be a significant military player, and of course to be hostile to Russia. that's a disastrous outcome for Putin, given in the context of all his imperial ambitions and all his talk of the Russian Empire and returning Russian land. So that will be a very difficult time for Putin when he has to accept that outcome and then realize that essentially he's failed. And not only has he failed, but he's failed while expending huge amounts of Russian wealth and prestige and Russian lives. That could put a lot of pressure on him and on his regime. It will certainly destroy his legacy, but it could also lead to much more immediate challenges in terms of the survival of his regime and his own political survival. So he's now really in a difficult spot in Ukraine, and I don't think he knows how to get out of it.
Peter, thank you very much for participation in our program. Appreciate it, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.